kind of self-starter, and he's drawn upon his in-country knowledge, working in Bougainville and Papua New Guinea, and also his great kind of roving knowledge that he's acquired about the academic literature on peace agreements and peace agreement implementation. And he's in this seminar, he's going to talk about his fieldwork, which he conducted in May. And which is in many ways, Kevin shared with us some of the 60 interviews that he managed to conduct in sort of 30, 40 days. It's an incredible batting average. And really what struck us, I think all of us from it, was that in many ways, Kevin is helping write a hidden history of the Bougainville Peace Agreement and the implementation thereof. Unfortunately, it's just me here today. Tiago is overseas and Anthony is in, does anyone want to guess where Anthony Regan is? He's in Bougainville. So I've got the pleasure of chairing this. Kevin's going to speak for 25, 30 minutes or so, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you everyone for being here online and supporting Kevin as we go forward. So Kevin, over to you.
Thank you very much.
Of course. Yeah, let me just take all my. Feel like I own the place.
No, you can't take my notes.
Oh, sorry.
That may be a problem. Okay, so first of all, thank you, Gordon, for that kind introduction. Thank you to everyone who's joining us here today and also the many people that are joining us online. I'd particularly like to acknowledge many of my friends and colleagues who are joining us from Papua New Guinea and Bougainville. As Anthony mentioned, I have an amazing panel. Professor Anthony Regan, who is regarded as a leading scholar on the Bougainville peace process, and also Dr. Tiago Opperman, who brings an enormous amount of knowledge and experience in both Papua New Guinea and Bougainville. And as Gordon said, Anthony and Tiago are both currently overseas, Tiago in PNG and Anthony in his second home in Bougainville. But hopefully they'll both be joining us online. So the purpose of my seminar today is to provide an update on my research, which seeks to examine the partial implementation of the Bougainville Peace Agreement. It's what is known as my midterm seminar, which, as the name suggests, means that I'm roughly halfway through my PhD journey. And just for context, I'm a part-time student. I enrolled 3 years ago this month, so I'm tracking pretty well in terms of what's expected. In terms of structure, I'll begin with a brief recap of the project, including some of the history and the context in which the BPA was formed. I'll then revisit my central research question and the puzzle that I'm seeking to solve through this project. Next, I'll discuss my fieldwork, during which I interviewed 64 participants in Papua New Guinea and Bougainville, highlighting key observations and emerging themes. I'll then speak to analysis that I've undertaken where I've been mapping specific BPA implementation mechanisms according to their implementation status. And I'll conclude with a summary of my preliminary observations and outline my plans moving forward. Before I begin, I'd like to speak to my positionality. My professional background is as a public servant. I was born in Canberra. I joined the public service at the age of 16. And more recently, I've worked as a development practitioner in PNG. And to put it into context, I spent 15 of the last 21 years living and working in Papua New Guinea, including 2 years in Bougainville. And for the past 8 years, I've worked as an advisor supporting the Bougainville peace process, first with the Autonomous Bougainville Government in Buka, and later with the Government of Papua New Guinea in Port Moresby. And this work has provided me with a unique opportunity to engage directly with the parties of the Bougainville Peace Agreement. I've been able to observe intergovernmental consultation processes. I've worked closely with officials to implement some of the key measures, and including most recently, supporting the post-referendum consultation process. Just a little bit about my research methods. So in conducting the research, I've used a number of methods. I've approached my research from a constructivist standpoint where I'm seeking to make sense of what is a living process. And I think, in the context of this topic, what makes it so topical and interesting is it's something that is yet to really be complete. And that process has allowed me to understand the different dynamics and actions that have affected the BPA implementation process. My research is also ethnographic, drawing on 8 years of observation and participation in the process. As a participant observer, I've been involved in a range of complex intergovernmental consultations, working closely with senior leaders. And these observations provide a rich layer to the foundations of this research project. Also undertaken extensive desktop research, examining the literature from a peace agreement implementation, civil war, and capacity development perspective, which I've overlaid with extensive readings on the history of Bougainville secession demands and the implementation arrangements that came into effect after the agreement was signed. And as I said, I've undertaken extensive fieldwork where I've sought the views and observations of over 60 participants, which I'm going to speak about in much more detail as part of this seminar. Have I gone too far? No. Okay. Right. Don't panic. I'm not. So, right. So my research focuses, as I said, on the partial implementation of the Bougainville Peace Agreement, which is widely regarded as one of the most successful peace settlements of recent times. And as a measure of success, peace has been sustained in Bougainville since the agreement was signed in 2001. And as many of you who are here today or joining us online would know, prior to the BPA being concluded, a series of negotiations and consultations took place that culminated in the Burnham Truce of 1997, which ended formal hostilities. In that sense, Bougainville has now sustained peace for 28 years, a remarkable achievement within the broader context of intrastate post-conflict peace settlements. Now I'd like to provide just a brief recap of my research projects. So as I've noted, the BPA is an example of a comprehensive peace agreement. And within the literature, several factors are identified as influencing success or failure of such agreements. Christine Bell, a noted international lawyer and constitutional scholar, has observed that peace agreements have evolved over many years. And academic interest has arisen given that most CPAs fail within just 4 years of an agreement being signed. The literature on CPAs looks to factors such as agreement design and the inclusion of provisions such as power sharing arrangements, third-party guarantees, and mutual dependencies. The design of a peace agreement can significantly impact whether a peace agreement succeeds or fails, and can have a substantial bearing on the success of broader peace processes. Scholars such as Barbara F. Walter highlight the challenges that arise when agreements fail to support good governance, and in particular, measures to support institutional capacity building. Others emphasise the importance of institutions that increase both the credibility of an agreement's terms, as well as the commitment of actors involved in the implementation process. So the design of peace agreements is critical. How an agreement is structured and the conditions it imposes directly impact implementation. Provisions that mitigate commitment problems, as well as those that increase costs or reduce fear, support sustained peace. Mechanisms that support continued dialogue allow for lines of communication to remain open, and guaranteed funding and support arrangements provide a basis through which to build momentum in supporting agreement terms. But as the Bougainville Peace Agreement has shown, implementation is often the most difficult part of the peace process, and implementation requires that the agreement operate in the real world, where practical and political realities can often diverge. As an example of the challenges that arise for implementation, a study by Madhav Joshi and others, which was published in 2015, examined 34 peace agreements signed between 1989 and 2015. And that study found that of the 724 implementation measures identified, only 49% were considered fully implemented by year 10 of the last observation. In the case of the BPA, peace has been sustained, and to a large extent, the parties have abided by the agreed terms. But a key question for me is to what extent has the BPA's design supported implementation, and how might partial implementation have undermined the peace process, and what risks might this pose to future recurrence of civil war? As I discussed in my confirmation of candidature seminar last year, the BPA is built upon 3 pillars: autonomy, weapons disposal and demilitarisation, and a referendum on Bougainville's future political status. And over the years, there has been considerable discourse on the strengths and the weaknesses of the BPA. Implementation has been a complex process and not without challenge. This has been particularly evident in the post-referendum decision-making process, which is currently underway and which has been running now for 5 years, and also with the full implementation of autonomy arrangements, which are a significant component of the agreement in terms of enabling Bougainville to build critical institutions of state and government. and both of those areas form a significant part of my research. The fact is that the BPA was designed to enable a gradual transfer of powers from the government of Papua New Guinea to the Autonomous Bougainville Government, aiming to prevent conflict recurrence through a self-sustaining autonomy process, leading to a non-binding referendum on whether Bougainville would become an independent nation state. However, effective implementation depends on capacity, both individuals and resources and institutions, and of course, trust on the part of both parties that they will honour the terms of the agreement. And the fact is that the BPA has seen very critical success. These include the constitutionalisation of arrangements in the immediate years following the agreement being signed, the weapons disposal process, which was certified by the United Nations, the initial phase of autonomy, which included the establishment of the Autonomous Bougainville Government, known as the ABG, and of course a referendum that was conducted in 2019. But we've also seen significant challenges in implementing other parts of the agreement, including the second phase of autonomy, particularly the drawdown of powers, and the finalisation of the post-referendum consultation process to determine what form Bougainville's political future will take. From my own observations, implementation has been constrained by limited capacity and resources, including critical financial resources, with the BPA lacking clear timelines and milestones for transferring powers and establishing institutions. This has been compounded by the absence of a formal jointly managed coordination and implementation mechanism, which has in turn led to significant challenges in mobilising critical resources, including constitutionally guaranteed grants. In turn, this has constrained the ability of the ABG to enliven many of the powers and functions required to enable effective restoration, development and governance, and of course, in the longer term, independence. So all of this feeds into my central research question, which is, in relation to the unusual success of the Bougainville Peace Agreement in preventing a recurrence of conflict, what might explain its limited success or mixed record of implementation? So this question seeks to guide my inquiry into how the design and implementation of the BPA have shaped its outcomes, both its achievements in peace building and its challenges in fully realising autonomy and the finalisation of an enduring political settlement. To explore this, I've developed 7 sub-questions, which I won't repeat here. However, these sub-questions seek to understand how the design and implementation of the BPA has influenced post-conflict stability and the risk of conflict recurrence. They explore why certain components, such as weapons disposal and the referendum and the constitutionalisation of arrangements have been implemented relatively well, while the second phase of autonomy and post-referendum arrangements has seen mixed or poor progress. My sub-questions also examine how this uneven implementation has affected the durability of peace, the role of institutional capacity deficits in both Bougainville and PNG, and the limited success of domestic and international capacity building efforts. And finally, they consider how the BPA's design and implementation experience may inform broader understanding of how comprehensive peace agreements can reduce the high rate of post-agreement conflict recurrence in intrastate conflicts. So turning to my fieldwork. So a critical part for me in addressing these questions is to understand how implementation has operated in practical terms, in the real world. So in May of this year, I undertook fieldwork in both Papua New Guinea and Bougainville. In total, I was able to interview more than 60 participants in just under 30 days. The fieldwork included interviews with a wide range of participants from both the national government and the ABG. In total, 64 participants were interviewed in Port Moresby, Buka, Arawa, and Buin. Participants were identified based on their roles before, during, and after the Bougainville crisis, particularly those involved in designing, negotiating, or implementing the agreement. Many were already known to me, while others were referred during fieldwork, including through recommendations from my panel chair, Professor Anthony Regan. I was also supported during the fieldwork process by my good friend Joseph Nobitow, who's a former ABG Chief Secretary and senior PNG public servant. And he voluntarily undertook a research assistant role. So he signed the confidentiality form and he assisted me and accompanied me on many of the interviews. So I'd like to acknowledge Joe, because the fact is, without him, many of the doors that opened to me would never have opened. It's the trust that he has that was extended to me. So the interviews were semi-structured, mostly one-on-one, with 3 conducted in pairs. Of those that were interviewed, 61 have agreed to be identified in research outputs, while 3 have requested anonymity. 40 interviews were held in Bougainville, 19 in Buka, 15 in Buin, and 6 in Arawa, While interview locations do not reflect regional ancestry, the cohort did represent a broad cross-section of Bougainvillians involved in the peace process or BPA implementation. These included community leaders, public servants, and political leaders. The remaining 24 interviews were all conducted in Port Moresby. These included Bougainvillians based outside the region and Papua New Guineans who have played a key role in the peace process, including public servants, former officials from the North Solomons Provincial Government and the ABG, national political leaders, and respected business and community figures. Of the 64 participants, 11 were women, and I want to acknowledge that that is a relatively small number in the context of the total interview cohort, but it does reflect some of the social and cultural realities that I faced, particularly as an outsider and a white man seeking to engage in this research. But those who did participate, people like Teresa Jane Tong, Rose Pihai, Elizabeth Bahrain, all remarkable women who at various times supported the peace process, offered powerful insights into gender, leadership, and peace building, and their contributions were deeply valued in this research and will certainly inform much of it. In terms of the roles, the cohort was diverse. I spoke with political leaders from Bougainville, including current and former members of the House of Representatives, former members of the Bougainville Interim Government and the Bougainville People's Congress, and former members of the North Solomons Provincial Government. So that spectrum really from pre-crisis to where we are now. I also interviewed PNG national leaders, past and present, including 2 Bougainvillian MPs who are currently serving in the National Parliament, and current and former parliamentarians who have played critical roles in the peace process. Public sector leaders from both governments were well represented, including both chief secretaries, as were community leaders, mid-level public servants, women leaders who I mentioned before, who all played critical roles before, during, and after the crisis. This broad mix of voices helped build a rich and layered understanding of how the Bougainville Peace Agreement is being implemented and where challenges remain. In the interviews, I explored several key themes to understand how the BPA is being implemented in practice in the real world. These included perceptions of the overall success of the agreement, intergovernmental coordination and cooperation, development of institutions and drawdown of powers and functions, institutional capacity and capacity building, leadership, the referendum, and the current intergovernmental dialogue process, including the post-referendum consultation dialogue. I was struck by the depth and candour of the interviews. Participants spoke to me openly, and they offered insights that spanned the pre-crisis period, the conflict itself, and the years that followed. These conversations have filled critical gaps in my own understanding and have added texture to what I had previously gathered through desktop research and my own observations. While many things aligned with my expectations, others were more surprising and will be drawn upon as the research proceeds. On the overall success of the BPA, all participants acknowledged its success in achieving its primary goal, ending the conflict and securing lasting peace. Many Bougainvillians that I spoke to felt that without the BPA, the region would have remained trapped in an endless cycle of war. In this sense, the agreement was seen universally as a turning point, first resolving local conflict and tension, and then halting full-scale violence. Coordination between the ABG and the national government was consistently described by participants as weak. The national coordination mechanism was seen as lacking institutional capability and a clear mandate. ABG officials often indicated that they became frustrated with the national coordination process, viewing it as irrelevant in the post-referendum context, and in turn, this has impacted on coordination more broadly. National agencies were described as resistant, territorial, and often disengaged. The lack of awareness about BPA obligations within the national government was also seen as a major barrier, impacting meaningful dialogue and consultation. It was clear from discussions with ABG participants that trust in the national coordination mechanism has eroded. Some officials described it as just another agency captured by the national government, no longer serving the bridging role that it was intended to form. While some indicated possible value in developing a new jointly owned mechanism, others felt that the window for reform had already closed, with focus now shifting from the realisation of autonomy to the transition to independence. On the drawdown of powers and the establishment of institutions, views were generally mixed. While the concept was embraced widely by ABG participants, its implementation was seen as having fallen short. Some participants blamed ABG leadership for missed opportunities, while others pointed to deliberate obstruction by national government officials. The ABG's constitutional architecture and successful elections were praised, but governance and service delivery remained an area of concern, as did the failure of the ABG to progress critical work on building oversight institutions such as an Ombudsman Commission and an Auditor General. Many participants spoke of the need for a mechanism to oversee both the drawdown of powers and the restoration of services. The general view was that the ABG had made significant gains in particular areas, such as the creation of the public service and drawdowns in areas such as mining, lands, and local courts. But commitment is a two-sided process requiring joint effort. Issues such as the failure to establish a mechanism as provided for under Section 49 of the Organic Law and Peace Building to coordinate restoration and development was cited as a failing, with blame attributed to both governments for lack of genuine commitment. On the Sharp Agreement, which was signed in 2021 and which sought to waive some of the critical requirements in relation to drawdown, such as a capacity assessment and notification, participants were pretty mixed in their views. Bougainville participants highlighted the intent of the agreement to overcome some of the challenges that had arisen in the past through limited engagement by national government counterparts. Other participants suggested that the agreement was somewhat short-sighted in the absence of clear process and milestones. And the failure to conduct regular reviews of autonomy arrangements, as required by the BPA to be undertaken every 5 years, was cited by many as being a major oversight, with many participants noting that the purpose of such reviews is primarily to assess progress and inform future direction. On institutional capacity and capacity building, the ABG public service were frequently described as under-resourced and lacking in terms of technical capacity. Issues around training were cited as having a significant impact on public servants being able to do their jobs, with reasons being attributed to continuing funding issues and limited and effective engagement with national government agencies. Some ABG public servants expressed concern regarding transparency, noting that institutions like the Ombudsman Commission and the Auditor General's Office have never been established, despite earlier promises, and that these institutions could play a significant role in both supporting and enforcing good governance. In the ABG, some public servants expressed the view that they lack the training or experience that they need to fulfil their roles effectively. Issues around misconduct were often seen as being grounded in ignorance rather than a genuine intent to break the law. As one participant told me, sometimes working in the ABG public service is like being handed a driver's license without the knowledge of how to drive the car. But equally, capacity at the national government level was cited as a contributing factor in supporting implementation of the BPA. Many public servants noted that those who were in leadership roles when the BPA was signed have retired or sadly passed on. This has led to a knowledge vacuum, with many younger public servants seeing as lacking the historical context or technical knowledge of what the BPA requires them to do. Leadership was a consistent theme raised during the interviews. Some participants expressed a view that leaders in the Bougainville House of Representatives should be provided greater support and training when assuming office. At the national government level, a consistent issue was the loss of leaders, with generational change resulting in a loss of knowledge and awareness of obligations contained in the BPA. A frequent frustration amongst Bougainvillean participants was that many national government MPs view Bougainville as just another province, with little recognition of its unique constitutional status. A failure on the part of leaders to honour financial obligations was a consistent point raised, with the national government's failure to honour the Restoration and Development Grant often being seen, or sometimes being seen, as a deliberate and political ploy. At the administrative level, concerns were often expressed regarding the ABG's capacity to manage and budget funds, in part due to the continued uncertainty that has arisen from the underpayment of grants. Accountability of leaders was also raised on both sides of government, particularly regarding shifting funding priorities because of the protracted post-referendum consultation process. But despite this, it was clear from all the interviews that leadership has shaped every phase of the peace process and its aftermath. Bill Skate was praised for initiating the Burnham process. Sir Kerry Murata was universally respected for his leadership in progressing constitutional amendments before the 2002 election. Many that I spoke to felt that had Sir Kerry not acted decisively, the agreement might have been abandoned. The role of leaders such as Sir Peter Barter, Sir Moy Abe, and Sir Puka Temu were frequently cited. On the Bougainville side, key Bougainvillean leaders such as the late Joseph Kabui, John Momus, James Tanis, and current President Ismail Tarama were all credited with building meaningful and effective relationships with national government counterparts, both during the negotiation of the agreement and the implementation phases that followed. Often, participants referenced what the late Bernard Narakobi called the Melanesian way, Here, there was a deep recognition of cultural tradition and the need for consensus decision-making as being a critical part of the ongoing peace process. The referendum was seen as a high point by all participants. It was described as orderly, transparent, and deeply emotional. The result, overwhelming support for independence, was seen by most participants as a moment of historical justice. However, a theme that emerged during the interview process concerned the non-binding nature of the referendum. Many participants who I spoke to in Bougainville believed the referendum would have guaranteed immediate independence. Some did not understand the non-binding nature of the vote, the obligation to consult, or the role that the national government and the national parliament, I should say, is expected to play. Awareness sessions in the lead up to the referendum were often described as instructional rather than informative. But despite this, almost universally amongst Bougainvillians that I interviewed, there was support for independence, with some participants tracing their aspirations back to childhood long before the crisis began. In this sense, the referendum was seen as a fulfilment of a long-held dream. Yet anxiety about the future was evident in many of the interviews that I undertook. Some participants feared stagnation and questioned how independence could or would be achieved in practical terms, whilst others feared that the continued delays could lead to division within the community, reigniting past grievances. Views on the intergovernmental dialogue process were generally mixed. Some participants noted that the role of the Joint Supervisory Body was essential, whereas others described it as ineffective, good at issuing directions, but poor at follow-through. Some said that the JSB was often crowded with routine business, diluting its focus on bigger picture issues. Bougainville participants often felt disrespected in joint government meetings, with the ABG frequently seen as being prepared and united, and the national government viewed at times as being less organised. Some suggested that the JSB has become the only real channel for Bougainville to project its agenda, highlighting a lack of broader cooperation at the intergovernmental level, suggesting the need for a greater number of mechanisms to support engagement and consultation. On the current protracted post-referendum consultations, most Bougainville participants believe delays were due to the national government's reluctance to engage meaningfully and deal with the issue. Some felt that Bougainville leaders had been sidelined, and there was a strong sense that the process lacked transparency and urgency. The joint post-referendum consultations were described as slow-moving, with little clarity on outcomes or next steps, with some participants expressing frustration that the referendum results, so overwhelmingly in favour of independence, had not translated into more immediate and decisive action. Many Bougainvillian participants spoke to me about the pan-Bougainville approach, which was so critical in the early stages of the peace process. Some expressed a view that the existing post-referendum consultations should benefit from greater inclusion from across Bougainville. Some participants expressed fear that without a binding process, the referendum result could be diluted or ignored. The absence of clear obligations and timelines was seen by many as a major weakness in the BPA's design, particularly in the post-referendum phase. So, in reviewing participant comments, many themes emerge. What is clear is that there is a sense that the full vision of the BPA has not been attained. This was reflected across all participants, not just in Bougainville. Whilst the early phase of implementation and the conduct of the referendum are widely seen as a success, many feel disheartened by the slow pace of implementation, which falls short of the vision set by its architects. There are various factors that can explain this mixed implementation success. Limited capacity, funding constraints, a lack of investment in training and development, an inability to adhere to the clear financial arrangements contained in the agreement, a failure to harness the drawdown of powers and develop effective institutions, in some cases poor or limited leadership at both levels of government, and at times poor commitment. And when considering the vast literature on peace agreement implementation, all are measures that contribute to peace agreement implementation failure. But a key question is, how have these issues manifested in the BPA implementation terms, and what might explain the BPA's success in maintaining and sustaining peace? As I noted in my last seminar, the BPA is a complex legal document. It comprises of 344 clauses, many of which contain clear mechanisms for consultation and review between the ADG and the national government. As part of this research project, I've mapped a total of 73 implementation mechanisms contained in the BPA that require specific actions to aid implementation. These include the formation of mechanisms, coordination arrangements, periodic consultations, and reviews. Of the 73 mechanisms identified, just under half have achieved only partial implementation. 34 remain unimplemented, and some of those are really critical in terms of coordination and support, and 7 are unclear with respect to their implementation status. Some of the causes include the establishment of oversight bodies, agreed arrangements in relation to employment visas, arrangements to ensure coordination and consultation on foreign affairs, and contributions to negotiations of international agreements that may affect the future of Bougainville. Others include representation on fisheries bodies and international fisheries negotiations, consultations on central banking arrangements, and provisions for the appointment of a panel of experts to make recommendations on capacity or economic circumstances related to the transfer of powers. Requirements for 5-yearly reviews of fiscal arrangements remain unimplemented, and a mechanism to coordinate restoration and development has yet to be established almost 25 years after the agreement was signed. And a similar assessment can be made when cross-referencing those provisions contained in the BPA with the relevant provisions in the National Constitution, the Organic Law, and the Bougainville Constitution. So what all this shows is that the BPA is an exceptionally well-designed agreement that incorporates many of the measures deemed necessary to contribute to successful implementation. But what is clear based on my preliminary findings is that the enabling environment required to enable successful implementation has faced considerable challenges. So to conclude, my research to date has been a really rich experience. The willingness of participants to speak to me, frankly, has provided invaluable insights. What is clear based on my research is that the BPA not only offers a unique case study, but a perplexing one in the context of peace agreement implementation broadly. That is, peace has been sustained for the best part of 30 years, despite a mixed record of success. And all of this makes for a rich research project. So having concluded my fieldwork and my primary desktop research, the next step is to commence the process of deep analysis and to write the thesis. In doing so, I look forward to giving life to the many voices that have informed the project through the fieldwork process. And I anticipate that writing the thesis will take me around 12 months. Might be ambitious, we'll see, at which time I look forward to presenting my findings. And just to conclude, my proposed research structure, thesis structure, which is still a work in progress, but essentially methodology, a chapter on the Bougainville conflict and the negotiations for peace, a chapter that looks more specifically and forensically at the Bougainville Peace Agreement, a chapter looking at comprehensive peace agreements and their role in application, followed by a chapter that looks at peace agreements and their application in the Bougainville context. I'll then conduct 3 case studies on the drawdown of powers and the realisation of autonomy, the coordination process, and the post-referendum dialogue. I'll then wrap that up with 2 chapters looking at partial implementation and analysis and discussion. So on that note, thank you very much for your patience and listening to me as I've garbled my way through this presentation. I always find the questions and answers process to be more informing, so I'll hand it over to Gordon to seek your views. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. No, that was anything but garbled. And I love that phrasing where you put right at the end, a unique but perplexing case study. You know, I think it's just a wonderfully evocative phrase. So you and I talk to each other reasonably often. I can ask you lots of pointed questions offline. I think it'd be a good opportunity here for everyone who's listened to this to ask Kevin questions. If you could please identify yourself, that would be great. And for those listening online, there's always a tendency to forget the people listening online, but we've got you. Please put your hand up, and we will come to you as well. So it's always a pregnant pause before somebody asks a question. So I'll ask one. I'll like hit that phrase, you know, you abuse my opportunity as the chair. It strikes me that one of the interesting things about this unique case is how many people involved in the implementation of the Bougainville Peace Agreement are versed in the Bougainville Peace Agreement. Like, what did you find from your interviews about that? I mean, was there a really deep knowledge about what the agreement said, or was the agreement more of a kind of signifier of something? So it was a kind of an emotional idea that everyone was attached to, and the actual what was inside of it, the kind of nuts and bolts of it, was not there. Because I certainly found in the time where I worked in Bougainville, and you were alongside me when we worked there was a very limited knowledge of the nuts and bolts of what the peace agreement said. What came out in the in the interviews about that. And thank you, Satish, who's raised his hand, who's going to ask the next question. But...
Right. Look, I mean, I think it's mixed. As I said during the presentation, I think, one of the factors that have impacted implementation as we've gone through the last sort of nearly 3 decades is that some of those people that were intimately involved in sort of drafting the agreement and establishing that peace agreement architecture have moved on. So it's variable in terms of understanding. I think, at some levels there is very detailed understanding, particularly amongst the lawyers. That's their job. They need to understand the clauses. I think, though, that the agreement itself is almost symbolic now. It's seen as, it was the instrument, it was the document that led to a sustained peace. But to be honest, in terms of my observations, having worked supporting the process for the last 8 years, there is, I guess, mixed understanding. There's a lot of myths, I guess, about what it should do and what it shouldn't do. But yeah, it's probably difficult to quantify.
I like that term, myths. Satish, I'm going to unmute you.
Thanks. Look, thanks again, Kevin, for that question. I think the research itself is long overdue. I'm just wondering, Kevin, if your question is a bit too demanding on the BPA, but if as you say, if you look at the 3 pillars of the Bougainville Peace Agreement, autonomy, weapons disposal, and the referendum, you'd have to give huge ticks to each one of them. So on those 3 pillars specifically, the BPA would be deemed to have been quite successful. Now, you sort of go deep down, and it seems to me that the questions you are asking is as to whether the capacity that was intended to be built within Bougainville, we have fallen short of that. And we have fallen particularly short in terms of reviving the economy. Those 2 questions I don't think were ever in the BPA. So I'm just asking as to whether the question you're posing on BPA in terms of its implementation is beyond what the BPA was meant to do to begin with. Thank you.
No, thanks, Satish, and also acknowledging the amazing work that you've done in the Bougainville space. And, I'm a strong fan of what you do. Look, I think you're right in some senses. I mean, the BPA is a comprehensive peace agreement, but how comprehensive can it be? I guess I would put it in these terms. We have the constitutional grant provisions, particularly the Restoration and Development Grant, which were there primarily to restore services and build infrastructure to levels that were there before the conflict began. And I guess in that context, those grants are meant to sort of provide those foundations or build those foundations to allow for an economically enabling environment. And through that, then you start to see, green shoots in the economy. You start to see things start to rebuild. I guess one of the things I would say, and I don't want it to be seen that this is in any way a critique of the BPA. Really, what I'm trying to do is to understand what's contained in it, what's worked well, what hasn't worked well, and what might have been done differently. And that informs then the broader literature on peace agreement implementation. But I take your point wholeheartedly, Satish. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
Thanks, Kevin. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is John Barry. I'm a master's student, Masters in Public Policy. Thanks for the presentation. It's really in-depth. Looking forward to the final presentation. But just a reflection from me. I was wondering what the median age of the people that you interviewed was, and what it compares to the median age of people in Bougainville. I asked that because often peace in Papua New Guinea and Melanesia, it's made by people that are in power, but then it's up to the young people to implement.
Yeah.
And you might have the point in your overview that the Melanesian way might be a way of thinking about how the peace was put forward as maybe a symbolic attainment, but in the Melanesian way, it doesn't talk about Melanesian policy, for instance, and who implements and how it's measured, and it's often left to the generation that inherits peacetime to make up the procedures. And so, just thinking in terms of the demographics in your analysis, it's maybe removed from the BPA's 3 pillars per se, but it's there because they've inherited the BPA. As you say, it's been 20 or so
28 years.
So that the generation that's now entering the public service in Bougainville is inheriting this
monster.
So just thinking about the demographics and how this is sustained in Melanesia, Papua New Guinea. How does that inform your work?
Look, I mean, one thing I didn't ask for is people's ages. What I can say is that I interviewed quite a broad spectrum. So I interviewed people like Sir Moabe, who was very critical at the national government level in shepherding through those constitutional amendments. I interviewed quite a few people who are actively involved in the conflict or lived through the conflict. But I've got a good cohort there of young public servants on both the ABG and the national government side. I probably didn't go into detail in that in terms of observations, because when I came out of this and I wrote it up, it was like 8,000 words. And it's like, how do you condense that into a 30-minute presentation? But I think, you know, amongst the younger public servants, there is a degree of frustration that they haven't, I guess, been equipped with that knowledge and understanding. I think both in Bougainville and in the government of PNG, there is a huge thirst for people to be not re-educated, but to essentially be taught about the history and the context of the conflict and what the obligations that arise through the BPA are. I certainly think in terms of the Melanesian context, one of the most striking things for me that came through in my interviews with Bougainvillians, and these were mostly community leaders, so not people involved in the political process, was this sense of a pan-Bougainville process and how critical that was in the early stage of the peace process in bringing the Bougainville parties together to unite on a common position. And quite a few of the people that I spoke to felt that the post-referendum consultation process currently underway could benefit from a similar approach, because as we know, in the post-referendum consultations, it's the political leaders that are in the room. And I think having that increased community representation, which includes women, young people, churches, you know, the full spectrum, could be very useful in terms of informing next steps. But yeah, I don't know if I'm legally allowed to ask ages, so I didn't.
One thing that strikes me about research conducted in Bougainville is how little people talk about the mine.
Yeah.
Even though in the popular imagination, the conflict was all about the mine. So I was wondering how does it feature? What role does it play?
Yeah, I mean, it's there. It's kind of constantly there under the surface. And certainly in many of my interviews, people talked about their views on the mine. They talked about their views in relation to the role that the mine played in the conflict. And a couple of people I spoke to talked about the role of the mine in terms of the broader reconciliation and peace building process moving forward. I don't think that there's any huge drive at the moment to rush forward in redeveloping the mine, but I think that there is a recognition, and this came through from the Bougainville political leadership that I spoke to, that the mine and mining in general will play a critical role in Bougainville's future. But without betraying confidence, I won't mention a name, but one very senior leader I spoke to said that in looking at the BPA, one of the failings, not a failing, but one of the things that he thinks should have been addressed that wasn't addressed at the time, but because of the fact that this was about, providing an end to the war, was actually also coming to some kind of resolution and understanding about what role Pangunu should play. So we've gone through this past 20 years, we've tried to realise autonomy, we've tried to do all of the things that we're meant to do to, I guess, sustain Bougainville. But it's kind of the elephant in the room, I think, in a lot of cases. A recognition that it does have an important role in the future, but also an understanding that there's much more to be done to heal from its role in the conflict. And I think, and that's not just the Panguna landowners. All Bougainvillians lost relatives and others during the conflict. So it's not just a Panguna issue, it's a whole of Bougainville issue. And I think resolving the Panguna issue will require all of Bougainville potentially having some kind of say. And there is provision under the current Bougainville Constitution for plebiscites, which could be used for that purpose in terms of garnering views. But yeah, it is kind of the elephant in the room. People don't really want to talk about it, not in that level of detail anyway. So I hope that answers.
Interesting what's said and what's not said. I mean, how often did it pop up in the interviews?
Oh, probably it was mentioned in at least half of the interviews, right, but more so in Bougainville than at the national within Papua New Guinea level.
Right, we've got another person online here. So JDG, who is Jim Della Giacomo, I know. Jim.
Thank you, Gordon, and thank you, Kevin, for a very articulate presentation. I echo Gordon's remarks that I think it was very coherent, and I think right at the beginning you referenced that Bougainville, and I quote almost, that is one of the most successful peace agreements. I'd be interested to know what you're using as references or as a reference group, and what Bougainvillians, if any, have referenced, and whether their success is being measured against other peace agreements that have been implemented in the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, or in this time frame. Thank you.
Yeah, look, I think, so that comment where I mentioned that, the vast majority of peace agreements fail within 4 years of an agreement being signed, has come out in a lot of the literature that I've read. I mean, you're right. I mean, you're not comparing like with like. Every peace agreement is different. The dynamics, the factors, the drivers, all of that come into play. I think, though, when you look at people like Joshi and a colleague here at the ANU whose name I've just forgotten, Chakma, I think, there is a lot of research out there. And I guess, it looks at those key implementation measures and those factors of design and how that impacts on peace settlements more broadly. So I don't really know if that answers your question, but that's kind of, it bears out quite significantly in the literature on civil war and peace agreement implementation, as to sort of, the fact that is a large majority of peace agreements do fail very early in the implementation phase.
It's an interesting question, though, which is like how you often heard in Bougainville people saying it's one of the most successful peace agreements, but it was never compared to what. And one of the things that I found when I was there was people from Northern Ireland came over, there were people from South Sudan came over, and there was and the effort was an attempt trying to kind of parallel learning, knit together knowledge. And it was pretty awkward in lots of ways, because no one had really sort of thought about these other peace agreements in any real sense.
Yeah, and if I could just add to my response, I think it's also, how do you find success? How do you define success? So if you look at the BPA in terms of some of those technical elements, has it been successful? Well, yes, very successful in some parts, but challenges in those other parts. In terms of success in sustaining peace and preventing a recurrence of civil war, you don't have any more successful agreement of recent times that I'm aware of. You probably are, Gordon, you're the expert. But I think, when I get to writing the thesis, I will start to look at some of those factors in terms of particularly the Melanesian context. I think, you can't compare the Bougainville crisis to war in Sudan or other parts of the world. Every sort of conflict is unique in terms of the factors and variables that drive it. But I think as part of my research, as I start to do the deeper analysis and prepare to write the thesis, one of the things that I will look at is, well, what makes Bougainville so successful, and what are some of those cultural aspects that have been drivers?
Yeah, no, and also like such a subjective criteria. I mean, I was in Northern Ireland for the last 2 weeks, which had its own comprehensive peace agreement. We would say it's a success, not because the institutions have stood up, but because violence has largely stopped. No one's really assessing what Article 2 or Strand 3 of the agreement is in many ways. So we have 3 questions, and we might take Meg, and then I'm going to take Sinclair, and I don't know your name, but we'll take you as number 3.
Okay.
And
then we'll probably go.
Why don't we take them 3 of them as a collective?
Thanks for the very clear presentation. You had a bit of a teaser in there, and then you didn't do anything with the gender question. You talked about the powerful insights from 11 women, but that's been a criticism of the whole process of the BPA and the dialogue and the promise of including women, and then it doesn't happen in many cases. And I didn't see in your outline how you were going to cope with that inclusivity, gender issues. So I'm interested to hear how you're going to approach it.
Well, look, do you want to?
Or do you want to go on?
No, go 1, 2, 3. Yeah, and then I'll.
It's a good question. Sinclair.
Yes, sort of quick one. It's hard not to ask in sort of these current times, and that was really around the role of sort of external actors. And particularly in the context of what many people have, talked about as a stalemate sometime between the 2 sort of principal parties to the peace agreement. Just sort of from your extensive interviews and the field that you've been talking about, what are the expectations? What kind of expectations have you heard from interviewees of external actors?
TJ?
Kevin, thank you so much for your presentation. Yeah, I guess my question is along the line of what you mentioned, right before you get the questions from us about culture.
Yep.
And I know that you said, in the peace agreement, the Melanesian way was very pivotal.
Yep.
In that, so I was just wondering, in terms of like the joint JSB, was there like any evidence of like culture being implemented as well? Because I guess in terms of Papua New Guinea and politics, I don't think we can really, we try to separate culture
Yep.
from the way we do life generally, and that includes politics, but
It's intertwined.
it's so intertwined, so I
Yep.
just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
No worries. I'll go to you, Meg, first. So yeah, in terms of the role of women, and I didn't probably, again, it came down to how much could I include in this seminar. From my observation, so I interviewed Teresa Jangtong, who was the mayor of Arawa when the Bougainville crisis erupted. She's a Panguna woman. She's a chief in matrilineal society. She played a very significant role in terms of mediating between the BRA and the national government forces. I spoke to Elizabeth Bryan, who's a North Bougainville woman, who talked about the power of prayer and the way in which women would travel down to Arawa and voice their concerns and really talk about how the conflict was impacting on them as women and impacting on the family more broadly. In terms of the inclusivity of it, I would have to say that when I look at what's happening today, there is an absence of women. There really is. I mean, certainly there are a number of women who are in the ABG, in the House of Representatives, but their voices are generally not heard. Certainly that will be a factor that I look at as I start to do the write-up, in terms of, I think that there's a really great story to be told about the role that women played during the conflict and the negotiations and the consultation, but there's been an absence of women's voices, I guess, at the broader level since the agreement was signed. But that's not to say that they haven't continued to play an enormous role with people like Sister Lorraine and Rose Pihai, who's from South Bougainville, who I interviewed, who's actively involved in trying to resolve issues down in the south in Bougainville. But I take your point, and I agree. It's a frustration, I guess, from my own perspective, just in academic terms, how I think the role of women should be more elevated and the voices should be heard.
People like Sister Lane felt there were promises that were unfulfilled.
Yes.
About the process itself.
Yeah, and Teresa Jangtong spoke about that as well. Sinclair, if external actors, it did come up a few times. I mean, I think there's a recognition and an acknowledgement of the very critical role that New Zealand played in terms of getting us to the stage where we had Burnham and then the agreement came through. There's a recognition of the role that Australia continues to play, and New Zealand and others, in terms of providing very valuable technical assistance and funding support to both the national government and the ABG to support Bougainville. One of the interviews I had, there was a view expressed that the signatories to the agreement, so Australia, New Zealand, Vanuatu, Fiji, the Solomon Islands and the UN, should be more assertive in, I guess, sort of reminding the parties, including the national government, that whilst this is a non-binding referendum that is still constitutionally mandated, and that there is still an expectation that a process will follow, that it isn't just simply a yes or no, you will be independent or you won't. I have to be careful in what I say. I think the international partners have balanced their role and responsibility incredibly well in terms of the support that they've provided. But that isn't to say that they couldn't be more actively involved and shouldn't be more actively involved in terms of the post-referendum process. And we're seeing that through the appointment of Sir Jerry Matapare as a post-referendum post-referendum consultation moderator. And of course, we have the UN there all the time. But again, it'll be part of my deeper analysis is into the role that they played and how that has manifested as the agreement has been implemented. And GJ, yeah, I think you're absolutely right in terms of the way in which culture is intertwined into every aspect of Papua New Guinean society. I'm an outsider. I've lived there for 21 years and I still don't understand it in terms of its complexities. But it is so deep and it is so powerful, I think, in terms of the role that culture and tradition plays, not just in relation to the BPA, but in relation to PNG more as a whole. I think in terms of the JSB, I would say that you see aspects of sort of, Melanesian tradition in terms of the way in which it's engaged. I think, white people who get to observe these types of meetings walk in and we get frustrated after an hour because we haven't moved on from the first point or the first agenda item. But there is that real recognition that, Papua New Guineans, Melanesian people, it's a consensus process. Everyone, needs to be heard. And that's one of the things that I have thoroughly enjoyed as part of observing the Bougainville peace process, is that voices are allowed to be heard. And there is, I guess, a consensus process, and that does lead to delays. And I guess, just going back to my point before, I would hate for anyone to think that in any of this that I'm being critical of the agreement or critical of the parties or any particular side. I think one of the factors that has contributed to perhaps the BPA not being as implemented as Western-centric people would like is because PNG and Bougainville need to do it in their own way. It needs to be a joint process, a consensus process that recognises the fact that PNG and Bougainville are still Melanesian brothers and sisters, and that regardless of what form the future will take, that they will continue to be united in some form. And I think that's where the Melanesian way will really play a critical role.
All right, thank you very much, Kevin. And what an excellent timekeeping. The clock is going to strike 3:30, and which means that Yujia Chen, I apologize to you, but you can find Kevin at his email address or on LinkedIn and ask him a question. So.
Yeah, I think, can we go back to the slides just really quickly? And that's your
email address.
Yep.
I thought you had an extra slide that you'd forgotten about.
No.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, for attending. I think that these are really important landmark milestones in a stage of a doctoral journey. And the worst thing is when you do it, there's no one here listening to you or no one giving feedback to you. And you've all played really constructive and useful roles, everyone online and everyone in the room. So great job, Kevin. And
thank you. And for my part, thank you everyone for coming. I'm not an academic.
Well, you could have fooled us.
I'm not in my comfort zone in these types of environments, and it's great to see that there is so much interest because Bougainville.
And you got a clap from somebody.
Yeah.
So there you go. There you go. All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good job.